should I forgive as many as 7 times? Now, we have a habit, I think, of sort of painting a target on Peter's back and saying, oh, Peter, open your mouth and insert your foot again, right? Peter, you always say just the wrong thing, and here you go again. You're trying to put a limit on forgiveness, Peter. But you know what? I want you to understand that Peter is being incredibly generous here. Because in those days, Jewish custom, Jewish tradition taught that you had to forgive someone at least twice. If they do something wrong, it's mandatory, it's required, you forgive them twice. But after that, 3 strikes and you're out. And once you've forgiven twice, the third time you don't need to forgive anymore. So along comes Peter, and he says, Jesus, I think I understand a little bit about what you're trying to get at here and what you're trying to teach us. And so all these rules about just forgiving a couple times, no more of that. Jesus, I'll forgive 7 times if you want me to. Right? That's more than double what was expected. So Peter has this very generous idea, at least in his day, a very generous picture of forgiveness. He says, should I forgive 7 times? Very practical question. And Peter is going above and beyond what was expected to him. How generous do we have to be with our forgiveness? Think about that. Because you know what? We all have someone that we need to forgive, right? Can you think of that person? Could be any number of things. I mean, it could be something that happened a long, long time ago. For some of us, your parents hurt you way back when. Maybe they were very critical of you. They always nitpicked and found the faults. And even today, you have that nagging sense you just can't do anything right. And their voice is just replaying like a loop in your mind. And you feel that anger. You still feel it. Maybe you and your husband, you and your wife had just an all-out fight last week, last month. And things got heated. You each said some things you just shouldn't have said. You didn't mean it, but you said it, you can't take it back. And you've sort of moved on, but there's still that anger that's just simmering there. Colleague, you thought they were for you. You thought that you could count on them. You worked with them, and you thought they were, an ally in the office. And then you find out that they threw you under the bus to advance their own reputation. Oh, are you angry? How generous do you have to be with your forgiveness? Very practical question. Now, I think I can boil the whole sermon down to one sentence. So if you can listen to this, hear it, remember it, live it, you can go home right now. Here it is. Listen. Because we have been forgiven the unpayable debt, we must forgive others by remembering that what it cost the king to repay our debt. All right, in a nutshell, let me say it one more time. Because we've been forgiven the unpayable debt, we have to forgive the debts that others owe us by remembering what it cost our king to pay our debt. You still want to hang on here the rest of it? This is pretty hard to really plumb the depths of that, I think. But here it is. Here's the story Jesus tells. Jesus answers Peter's question with a story, a parable. And in the parable, you've got a king who's settling accounts. The king is going through the books. He's audited, maybe done an audit, and he finds out there's some people that owe him money going way back. And so he's settling the accounts. He's cleaning up the books. And he finds this one servant. We read that he owes 10,000 talents. Now, that's not all that helpful to us. If you look at the bottom of the page, you'll find a little footnote that maybe helps us a little bit. Footnote says that's millions of dollars. And that's reasonably accurate, but here's the thing. A talent wasn't a unit of currency. It was actually a unit of weight. And so the talent really depended on what you were actually weighing. I mean, if you're weighing silver, 1 talent of silver was not worth as much as 1 talent of gold. So if you're measuring talents of gold, you could, the value would be infinitely higher. So scholars look at this and they like to debate and discuss, but here's the bottom line. It's millions is reasonable, but it's actually probably more like billions and maybe even trillions of dollars. A phenomenal debt. By the way, just a little side note, this makes you wonder, how does a servant like this acquire such a debt? I almost wonder if this is not all on the up front. And that could be what Jesus is hinting at. It's hard to say for sure, but bottom line is this is an unpayable debt. In fact, a little later on in the story, when the king is saying, okay, you can't pay this, then I'm going to throw you in jail. And if you look in verse 25, the king says, I'm going to sell your wife, your children, your house, your car, whatever, everything. I'm going to liquidate everything that you have. I need to, if you're going to even make a dent in paying me off, I have to tear your life to pieces. I have to take everything you have and liquidate it. You have no more life, no more assets, everything. If you're even going to make a whisper of paying off this debt. To pay off the debt would require this man to tear his life to pieces. Now, stop and consider, what is Jesus trying to impress upon us at this point? Well, the main thing at this stage is that you and I, well, we're that servant in a way, right? We owe that debt. We owe a debt, an unpayable debt to God. And that's Jesus' starting point. He wants us to recognize that we owe a phenomenal, unpayable debt to God. Now, what is a debt? A debt is an obligation. A debt is something that we owe another person. And there are a number of different ways to think about that, but here's the simplest way in terms of our relationship with God. When you and I, if we're in a relationship with each other, if we have a friendship, and I do something to violate your trust, or if I do something to hurt you, there is a sense that now I owe you something. That relationship is not whole anymore. And so something has to happen to make it whole again. I owe you something. I owe you an apology. I owe you the obligation of trying to show that I'm not going to make that same mistake again. So anytime there's a breakdown in a relationship, there's a debt that's created. And the Bible shows us that really the same thing is true for us in our relationship with God. When we don't live as God intends us to live and calls us to live, then there's a debt. There's a relational obligation to God. Now, nowadays, how do people try to pay that debt? How does our culture try to balance out or make our relationship with God whole? Well, one of the main ways we hear today is what I call Curious George theology. Now, I'm not here to pick on Curious George, but some of you kids, you've read Curious George stories, right? You younger ones, and kind of the stories are all the same in a way. I mean, that's a good thing. But, right, Curious George, he goes somewhere, he goes like to the zoo, or the circus, or the airport, or the hospital, right? He goes to one of these neat little places, and then what happens? He causes trouble, right? He does something wrong, and chaos, he does and then everybody comes and they're angry. Curious George, how could you do this? And Curious George feels very, very badly. And then the next thing that happens in the story is Curious George sees someone in trouble. He sees a little boy or a girl who's lost, or and he fixes it. He kind of saves the day, right? And then everybody comes back and they all gather around and say, oh, George, look at this. You've done such a good thing. We're so pleased that, and everything is forgiven. Right? Honey, you remember those stories? So the idea is that some people take this idea into their relationship with God. They say, well, I've done a lot of bad things. But I think at the end, the good things that I've done will outweigh and cancel out the bad. I may owe a debt to God, but all the good things that I've done pay that debt off. The problem is, we vastly underestimate the debt that we owe. Jesus says the debt is 10,000 talents. It's unpayable. If you were to keep a record of every little thing, every little time the thought pops into your mind, every little time you say something that was not very nice, every time you do something that hurts another person, you keep a long record, that list would be unbelievably long. Now, the other way that people try to deal with this sense of debt or obligation is we try to deny it. We say things like, you know what, guilt is just it's an artificial construct. Guilt is for people who think that there is such a thing as right and wrong. You maybe heard people that say that. problem is, so you can kind of deny that we're guilty, you can deny the debt, but then the question is, why do people struggle so much with feeling inadequate and feeling even shame culturally? We're a culture that has this simmering sense of anger and inadequacy. And that's because the Bible says we owe God our lives. We owe Him everything. We owe Him our lives as worship and service and obedience. And if we fail to live up to that, we have the unpayable debt. Now in the story, here's what's remarkable. The king calls this servant. The servant can't pay the debt. He has this unpayable debt. And he begs and he pleads. And in verse 27, the king says, we read, has pity on him. And he does two things. He cancels the debts and he lets the servant go free. The servant takes pity, and out of his pity he cancels the debt and he lets him go. Now, pause on that for a moment, reflect on that, because the debt doesn't just evaporate. The debt doesn't just disappear. But what happens is the king says, I will absorb the cost. I will pay the price. I will take the hit. So this massive debt, this debt that would have required this other person to tear his life to pieces, is now passed on to the king. And he takes on the devastation, the financial ruin of that debt. And the second thing the king does is he lets the servant go. Now, in those days, a lot of times the reason a person ended up as a servant to begin with is because they didn't have bankruptcy court in those days. You couldn't go to court and just file bankruptcy. You had to become a servant of someone. And then you would work that debt off. And once the debt was gone, then you didn't have to be a servant anymore. And so when the king wipes out the debt, when the king says the debt is gone, well, not only is this servant off the hook financially, but all of a sudden he's got a new life. He's not a servant anymore. He's released. He's set free. The king, the servant, he's a free person. The debt is no longer over his head. That debt no longer controls his life. He's a free person, and he's free to go. And of course, that's exactly what God does with us when He forgives us, isn't it? He takes our record, all the things that you and I have ever done, all the mistakes that we've made, all the poor decisions that we've made, all the things that we've said in a moment of anger and frustration, all of the failures that we know are way back in our past and we still struggle with feelings of guilt over it. God takes it all and says, I'm canceling it. It's gone. I'm removing it, but keep in mind, it doesn't just evaporate into nothing. God says, I will pay the cost. I will pay the price. I will absorb the cost, the hurt, the pain. I'll take it on myself. And now you are free. Sin is no longer your master, Paul says later on in the New Testament. You're no longer a slave to sin. That's been canceled, taken away. You're free. You and I are free, not only from the condemnation of guilt, but from the power of sin to control us. The unpayable debt has been paid. Now that's a mind-blowing thing, isn't it? Wow. But that's only the setup in Jesus' story. That's just the beginning. God pays this unpayable debt. But the point Jesus wants to make, and what He wants to impress on us, is that leaves us with a responsibility to forgive others. Now this servant, he's a free man. He walks out the gates of the palace, and he catches out of the corner of his eye, there's someone I used to work with. Yeah, he went, and I loaned him some money after, once upon a time. He was hard up for cash, and I loaned him some money. Now, I'm going to draw your attention to something. We read it's 100 denarii. Again, we have no idea really what that is, right? How much is that? Is that a lot? Is it little? Your NIV has another little footnote. And I want to say to you, I think the footnote, not the text itself, but the footnote is very inaccurate. It says it's just a few dollars. In those days, a denarius was what you paid, it was a day's wage. It was what you paid a working person for one day of work. Now, I don't know about you, but 100 days of work, that's not small change. Comparatively, compared to the $1 trillion or $1 billion debt, yeah, it's very little. But it's not insignificant. And the reason I draw that out is because sometimes we treat forgiveness as though something just for the minor little peccadillos in life, the minor little things. You know, your husband leaves his towel on the bed and it's kind of all wet, or you know, your wife doesn't keep her appointment, she shows up late all the time. You know, yeah, those are more like things that we get impatient about. Those are things that we have to learn to sort of overlook. We have to learn to absorb those things. As Christians, we need to have sort of good shock absorbers that can take a lot of those little annoyances. See, forgiveness is for things that are more significant. Forgiveness belongs. We're called to forgive people when they do things that are not insignificant, but actually rather important, rather painful. But that's not what happens, is it? I mean, the servant comes in and he holds this guy up and says, "You owe me money. Pay me what you owe." Now we see it. It's so obvious in this story how absurd this is. But can we be honest with ourselves for a moment? Can we do the same thing? We know that people owe us a debt. We owe that friends, colleagues, your spouse, your parents, your children, people have hurt us. They've said, done things, or not said and not done things you wanted them to, and the pain can linger. And you know what? When that happens, you know what our gut reaction is? That person who threw you under the bus, oh, when the opportunity comes, that person's name comes up in conversation, and don't you just want to say what you really think about that person and maybe damage their reputation just as much as they've hurt yours? You want to say back to your spouse the same kind of painful words that they said to you. You become sarcastic or passive-aggressive. Because what you're doing is you're saying, pay back what you owe. You owe me, I'm going to make you pay. Right? Pay back what you owe. It's so obvious in the story. Ooh, but it's not so obvious in real life, is it? Pay back what you owe. Now, what does Jesus want for us? Well, Jesus explains at the end of the parable, he says, Jesus wants you to forgive. I mean, the opposite is, if you aren't forgiving people, then God is not going to deal kindly with you. By implication, of course, what that means is that we who have been forgiven much must be ready to forgive much. We who've been forgiven much must be committed to forgiving much. How do you do that? Well, I want to go back to the Master for a moment. If you look in verse 27, I think we've learned an awful lot about what forgiveness looks like, or maybe some of the steps on how to do it. First thing, the servant's master takes pity on him. Right? He has pity. What is pity? What does that mean? It means the servant, his heart goes up. The master of the heart goes out to his servant. His heart goes out to him. If you want to forgive someone, your heart has to go out to that person. That doesn't mean you excuse what they've done. It doesn't mean that you minimize the pain that it's caused. But it does mean you try to put yourself in their shoes. You try to understand. You know, some of you have kids, and you think back when you were younger, and your parents, they disciplined you, or they said things to you, and you remember what you said in your mind if you didn't say it out loud, you remember? I will never say that to my kids. Haven't you said that? And then 20 years later, 30 years later, your kids grow up and you say the same thing, and in your mind you say, oh my goodness, I've become my mother, I've become my father. But you know what's really happening here? You're putting yourself in their shoes. You begin to realize, my mom wasn't a monster. Yeah, maybe they said things that were painful, that hurt. They weren't right, maybe they were wrong, but you actually begin to say, now I see the kind of stress they were under. Now I see what it was like for them. Doesn't make it right. It just means you learn to have pity on them. And then you cancel the debt. You give up your right to get even. And it's a decision. It doesn't happen automatically. It does not happen all at once. It's not that you forget what they've done. Forgiveness and forgetting are two different things. I'm not sure we have the human capacity to forget. But what we are called to do is, in that moment where we're tempted to pay back what you owe, we drop the charges. We say, I'm not going to mention their name in a negative way in front of someone else as much as I would like to. I'm not going to do it. When a thought comes into our mind, we dismiss it. We drop the charges. It doesn't happen all at once. You'll find yourself, you'll forgive, and then for whatever reason, some of that anger comes back, and you might slide backwards, and you have to move forward. It's sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 back. It's a process, but it's the process of dropping your right to get even, of letting go of hurting, of that desire to hurt them. And maybe, eventually, you get to the point where you wish them well. Maybe the relationship isn't always reconciled. Sometimes it is. Often that's what we hope for, but not always. But maybe you get to the point where you wish them well. That's what we're called to do. And I think, by the way, this is something that Jesus wants the whole church to take to heart. Jesus introduces this story by saying, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. This is what it's like when Jesus is exerting his influence, his authority in a community. So as a church, this is who we're called to be. We're called to be a people that are very forgiving towards people who've done heinous things, even if it's not against us personally. We're called to be a community of people who know that we've been forgiven and are quick to forgive others. God has forgiven us the unpayable debt, and we're called to forgive others. And this forgiveness may be the most difficult thing that Jesus asks of us. If we're honest with ourselves, there's a reason that forgiveness is so hard, and one of the reasons, at least, is that sometimes we like holding on to that grudge. That grudge, that bitterness actually gives us power. Because if you've done something wrong against me, and I don't forgive you, then I can feel, hey, you've done that, but remember what you've done to me. And there's a twisted sense of power there, isn't there? That sadly, over time, that anger calcifies. It ferments and sours. And it eats away, yes, at marriages, at families, friendships, in the workplace, but it also eats away at you, doesn't it? It makes you into a very bitter person, a very angry person. Jesus calls us to forgive. Now, why doesn't, go back to the man in this story, why doesn't he forgive? Why does this man leave the palace and then right away he's shaking his fist at someone else? Why doesn't he forgive? Well, I think you don't want to press this too hard, I don't think, but there may be a couple of reasons. Maybe he thinks, hey, I've just gotten away with this. This is amazing. I've just gotten away with $1 trillion heist. What a great thing. I suspect that this man's heart hadn't really grabbed hold of what had just happened. Maybe he understood forgiveness. He said, oh yeah, it's nice the king wiped it out for me, how good for me. But it never really grasped and gripped his heart. The grace had never soaked through. And I think that's true for us. If forgiveness is something that's difficult for us, one of the reasons could be is that the reality and the magnitude of God's forgiveness has never really soaked through our hearts. We can understand forgiveness, we can talk about it, but until we grasp what God has done for us, it's not going to make much of a difference in our daily life. It won't change us until we take to heart what God has done. Think of the leverage Jesus could have over us. He knows everything we've ever done. He knows all the mistakes we've made, the failures, the poor decisions, the things we've said to others that hurt them, the things we've said behind their backs, the things we've thought. If Jesus had that list, think of the leverage he could have. But he doesn't do that. He takes a different approach, doesn't he? His heart goes out to us. He has pity on us. The cross is the supreme example of God's pity for us. He looks on us in our brokenness and he says, I love you enough that I will tear my life to pieces for you. I will lose everything. I will take the hit. I will take the loss. I will become the sin for you. And when that begins to work on our hearts. It begins to change us. Granting forgiveness cost God everything. It tore him to pieces on the cross. When that becomes real to us, we begin to say, how can I not forgive someone the comparatively small debts that God has asked me to forgive? Jesus answers Peter's question. He says, Peter, you don't need to forgive 7 times, but 77 times, or other translations, 70 multiplied by 7. Jesus isn't putting a number on it. He's saying infinitely. Infinitely. Take your best, most generous answer and multiply that by infinite. That's a lot that God asks of us. But the only way, and the reason God asks that of us, is because He's already forgiven much more of that, much more than that in us. Let's be generous in forgiving. Let's be quick to forgive, because God has forgiven far more in us than we will ever have to forgive in anyone else. Let's pray. Gracious God, your mercy is new every morning, and you are compassionate and gracious. You are slow to anger. You are abounding in love. You've removed our sins from us as far as the east is from the west, and just as a father has compassion on his children, you have compassion on us. Lord, we pray that the magnitude of your forgiveness and your grace would saturate our hearts and our minds, so that the people we need to forgive, we're quick to do it. It's not always easy. It's never going to be easy. But Lord, we pray that when it's difficult, that we would look to you, and that your grace would enable us and empower us to be people who forgive. In Jesus' name, amen.